Hello everyone, this is APUSH History, Period 4 Review, and this is Mr. Ashby here. We're looking at basically 1800 to 1845 in this time period. In this time period, we're looking at some big ideas here. The really big ideas is the role and relationship between the federal and state governments and how they will continue to evolve during this time period. This era is going to experience a rapid economic, territorial, and demographic change. We're going to see, even though we're going to see a rise of nationalism during this time period, we're also going to see rampant sectionalism that's going to be increasing by the 1840s. The new republic will also both extend democratic rights to pretty much all white males, at the same time struggle to extend those democratic ideals to all Americans, especially African Americans, women, and Native Americans. And we're going to also see various type of reform movements that will seek to change American society through this time period. Typically, the AP test likes to break this section up into just two sections. Even though it's period 4 altogether, we see the Jeffersonian era being the first part under Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Adams, and the Jacksonian era with Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, and Tyler, and you can even push Polk into the very end of that era. Okay, there's 10 sections we're going to be going through in this time period. First is the politics of this time period, some general overview of the big political ideas that was going on and the big movements that are going on in this time period. It started off with the Revolution of 1800 that sort of transformed the political scope from Federalist to Democrat Republican under the Jefferson presidency. Jefferson will win the election of 1800, and he'll transfer power peacefully for the first time pretty much in almost in world history. So the really first transfers power peacefully. Eventually, under Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, we're going to see the era of good feelings. This is going to start after the election of 1816. Once the Federalist Party starts to disappear in 1817, we're going to have a one-party system for about 8 years until we create a second party under the Jacksonian Democrats. But again, in this, eventually factions will form within the Republican Party and sort of break this up into several different sort of ideologically different groups of people within this one party. The corrupt bargain was another big political aspect that happened in 1824. This happened when, even though Andrew Jackson won the popularity vote by a large margin, John Quincy Adams will win the presidency because not any one candidate will win the Electoral College. They will go to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives Speaker is Henry Clay. He will give his support to John Quincy Adams in this corrupt bargain, allowing him to become this, having him become the Secretary of State. 4 years later, Jackson will institute a new political party called the Jacksonian Democrats. And before that happens, we see a slow transition of white males gaining the access to vote for the first time. Pretty much, states are going to start dropping all suffrage laws, taking away the ability for white men to vote. Pretty much, by 1828, if you're a white man in America, you could vote with very few restrictions whatsoever. So in 1828, we see Andrew Jackson winning handily over John Quincy Adams. Again, you do see the sectional divide there between the North and the South and the West. And this will give the rise to the second two-party system a few years later, when these disenfranchised groups of people and the people that were sort of these former Federalists, then Democrat Republicans at the very end, sort of were out of party. So they formed this new Whig Party under Clay and Webster. Okay, the foreign policy during period 4, some things to look out for. One thing was, the big concept was the United States was really wanting to seek to expand its global presence by focusing expansion in the North American continent, meaning they were really wanting to sort of get out those foreign powers of England, Spain, and France. The really first thing that happened in this period was the huge purchase of Louisiana in 1803. Jefferson's going to have a big sort of ordeal about buying this. Remember, the real reason of him buying this was he really wanted to gain access to the Mississippi River. He was wanting to buy the port of New Orleans just to gain access to it. Napoleon wanted to sell the whole thing because of his issues with other wars going on this time period, and Jefferson bought it. And there was some constitutional issues because he did use implied powers to buy this. He will double the size of America during this time period. And that's going to be a huge part of Americans moving westward. Because again, even though Americans in this time period really typically will not go into this area of Louisiana, we're going to see this whole area being a area with the ability to then have natives being put into this area and removed from the areas, especially Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, the Sox and the Fox tribes up in Indiana and Illinois. We also see the first international forays with Jefferson looking at the Barbary pirates off the coast of Africa. Rather than paying tribute to these tribes, he would rather just build a navy and basically threaten war, which he basically gets them to back down. The War of 1812 was a major foreign policy, which we'll talk about in a little more detail in another slide or two. After the War of 1812, the Rush-Bagot Treaty will finalize the agreement with Britain to disarm the Great Lakes. This is a big one right here, the Adams-Honest Treaty in 1819. Spain decides to sell the U.S. Florida in basically a connection to us giving up rights to some of the fringes of the Spanish territory in the West. Monroe Doctrine does allow America to sort of put its foot down when it comes to making sure that no Europeans recolonize the freely independent states from the old Spanish Empire. Basically, there's no more colonization in the Western Hemisphere, and we will not intervene in European affairs in the Eastern Hemisphere. In 1836, Texas will declare independence and will win their independence from Mexico. This will cause a lot of anxiety and tensions over the eventual annexation of Texas into America. And by the end of this period, we're going to see the election of James Polk and the rise of Manifest Destiny in this time period of expansion westward with the war with Mexico and the grabbing of the Oregon Territory, eventually the acquisition of California. The War of 1812 does come up sometimes. That is a big one that you would need to know the causes of this. The biggest one is impressment. One example of that would be the Chesapeake Leopard affair, where the Leopard basically attacked and fired upon the American ship Chesapeake. In retaliation to this, we see Jefferson enact the Embargo Act, which was an epic failure. A year later, with Madison in office, he will basically renegotiate that with the Non-Intercourse Act. Macon's Bill No. 2 helped stop England and France from seizing American ships. But the writing was on the wall at this point. America was already sort of leaning towards war. You had these huge war hawks from the South and the West who were pushing and pushing and pushing for war. And eventually war will come in 1812. This war is a short war with really England taking a big advantage early on and neither side really coming to the end spectacularly. There's not much about the war itself, but a couple little things about it. Tecumseh and other natives will be supported by the British. We're going to see the Hartford Convention will be the fall of the Federalists at the very end of this war. The Battle of New Orleans will catapult a victory for the U.S., but also will catapult Jackson into prominence, eventually into politics. The Treaty of Ghent is going to end this war in 1814. And one big effect of this is that this is going to force America to start rely on itself to grow its own industry, especially with textiles. So this is going to be the start of America starting to become more industrialized without the connection with England. Okay, American expansionism was a big part of this time period. Obviously, starting with America's cities and population immigration growing. Also, we see the creation of the Louisiana Purchase will allow more Americans to move westward because it's going to allow Native Americans to be pushed into that unorganized Louisiana Purchase territory. So we have a national population growth, especially in the north. Again, we're going to have a national rise of population, but also created by immigration, especially Irish and German. We're going to see a rise of transportation, especially again in the northwest and the northeast, with the Erie Canals and Cumberland Road, and eventually railroads. And you're also going to see this huge cotton production down in the south with the advent of and the invention of the cotton gin. We're going to see more and more slaves being needed and more cotton fields and plantations put into production. So we're going to see this big western movement in the south because of the cotton production. And threats removed from continents also going to be a big part of expansion. We're going to see the French removed with the creation of the Louisiana Purchase. We're going to see the British removed with the War of 1812, not 1813. Sorry about that. We're going to see the Spanish removed from the eastern part of the continent with the Adams-Honest Treaty that gave us Florida. And of course, the Native Americans are going to be systematically removed by pretty much every president in office, all the way through Jackson and other presidents to follow. Some of the Native American removal that's going to happen, that's going to be a really big part of this American expansion westward. We're going to see the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, right prior to the War of 1812. We're going to see the first Seminole War in Florida. That's going to remove Native Americans from this area. We're going to see the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that's passed by Congress. Eventually, the Cherokee are going to sue against the Georgian and war chest for Georgia and win this case. Jackson is going to basically say, Marshall, you've made your ruling, now let's see you enforce it, and still force Native Americans off their land into this Indian territory out here in the West. That'll be the Trail of Tears. We're also going to see a rise of nationalism during this time period. Several different aspects of nationalism. One is cultural nationalism. We're going to see our first major literary and major art movement in this time period. We're going to see writers like James Fenimore Cooper and Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau and Emerson create these stories. We're going to see landscape artists like the Hudson River School with Thomas Cole and Frederick Church create these wide sleeping landscapes of this wild west of America. We're going to see John James Audubon study and paintings of birds. And economic nationalism was a big part of us expanding westward also. We have the American System by Henry Clay, which does give us a national bank supported especially in the giving of loans for western expansion and big companies. We're going to see a protective tariff to help protect our new industries and our first industrial revolution. And we're also going to see internal improvements and transportation improvements with canals, roads, and eventually railroads. And political nationalism, the biggest thing about this is really there was this only one political party for a grouping of time in the 18 teens and 20s. Again, this will bring on the era of good feelings. And some of the people left out of this new national culture, obviously women. Women were still sort of looked at as their domestic place was in the home. This was the cult of domesticity that was really big in the 1820s and 30s. Republican mothers, women should raise good young citizens, but again, the focus was them being in the home. The Second of Falls Convention was really the first time women tried to really band out together to gain more rights. It was a sort of a failure when it basically didn't really achieve much difference in this time period, but it will be a rise of feminism and be like a benchmark for the rise of feminism in decades and a century later. Obviously, African Americans basically really had no place in this national culture with pro-slavery arguments, racism, and bigotry in both North and South. And of course, Native Americans, even though they did rise up and have some resistance, it was met by forced removal and eventually removal to the West. Okay, rise in sectionalism, period 4. In spite of the increased nationalism, sectionalism will continue to plague the nation. Again, we have three distinct areas. We have the Northeast, up here by New England area. We have the Deep South, and we have this New West area. And they all really had very different ideologies and different thoughts about how America should grow. For state sectionalism, state governments will resist the authority of the federal government in many ways. One example in the North was the Hartford Convention, where we see the grouping of Federalists trying to strengthen their power and then failed. In the South, one example is the South Carolina's nullification crisis to this unheard of tariff. We see Daniel Webster, and South Carolina Representative Hayne debate about the legality of this tariff. Eventually, Jackson's going to order federal troops to basically remove anyone or any state not abiding to the tariff. Basically, it was going to play poker and force South Carolina to stop disobeying the tariff law. Before this happens, though, Henry Clay does broker a compromise to sort of end this nullification and tariff controversy. We also see national sectionalism that rises up. We see the Second Bank of America and the American system. We see internal improvements heavily favored by the West and the North. We see the protective tariff of 1816, which protects the North's industries. We see the Missouri statehood and the issues and compromises of that. Obviously, with Missouri wanting to become a slave state and Maine wanting to become a free state, both of them coming together, securing that balance of power in the Senate between North and South states. And of course, we have the national bank debate of Jackson, where he vetoes the national bank recharter and then eventually destroys it by taking its money out. We also have some Supreme Court controversy, and that is contributing to the rising sectionalism here. We have John Marshall in this time period, basically the judge from the late 1790s all the way through the 1830s. Some big court cases are those three. We have Marbury v. Madison, that's issues in judicial review in 1803. We have McCulloch v. Maryland, that gives constitutionality to the Bank of the United States and also implied powers. We also have Gibbons v. Ogden, which was that ferry boat that the court ruled that only the federal government could regulate interstate commerce, not the state governments. And the South has some regional identity or differences that will create more sectionalism. So we're going to look at the regional differences of both the North and the South here. So some of the issues with the South is there was a very sectional difference here. The cotton gin gave more importance to plantations and more importance to the ideology of slavery. Majority of Southerners did not own slaves. Even though they supported slavery, it was dominated by the planting class. And that was a big thing to think about, is that most Southerners did not own slaves, but they supported the institution itself. There also will be this code of chivalry in the South, this unwritten Southern honor that you have to defend not only slavery, but the Southern's way of life also. And in African Americans in the South and also the North, we will see some slave resistance in this time period. Mostly sabotage, runaways, slowdowns will be the main resistance. There will be a couple rebellions. One failed, one sort of did, I wouldn't say successful, but did go out and actually happen. The unsuccessful one was Denmark Vesey, which was found out before it happened in 1822. And then Nat Turner actually did create a rebellion, and what this is going to lead to is harsher slave treatment and harsher slave codes. We also see an abolitionist movement that sort of rises up in the North. We see David Walker and him create an appeal to the colored citizens of the world in 1829. We see the creation of the American Colonization Society that wanted to push freed Americans to Africa. And we also see the rise of the Liberator, printed and created by William Lloyd Garrison, a very extremist in the abolitionist movement. And the regional identity of the North was very different than the South. One, they did still rely a lot on farming, very mixed agriculture, small-scale farms. But we do see the rise of manufacturing during this time period and the rise of cities in this time period. Even though most Americans still lived on the farms and still practiced small agrarian farming, again, we do see the rise of cities and the rise of manufacturing. This really started happening after Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts allowed for mass production. Also, we see Robert Fulton create the steam engine that allowed for the steam production and to power an engine, which will really help revolutionize the transportation industry, allow them to basically go upriver through canals, being propelled by the steam engine. And eventually in the Waltham system in Lowell, Massachusetts will be created to sort of revolutionize and bring costs down in the manufacturing of industries, especially textiles. They're going to use farm girls for cheap labor. Eventually, these farm girls are going to be supplanted by Irish immigrants. And again, we see the rise of the North and the population of the North go up a lot because they're Irish and German immigrants. We also see the rise of a new national party called the Know Nothings or the American Party. That'll be basically a one-platform party based off their anti-immigrant or nativist ideology. And the last section of reform in the period 4, it all does start off with the Great Awakening and revivalism. Charles Finney is going to start spreading new religious ideologies, being more accepting to blacks and women within the church and faith. They're also going to push away predestination for good. This will spur a wide range of reform movements that are going to flourish in this time period. Some successful and a lot of them very unsuccessful until later on. We see the rise of temperance or the end of alcoholism in this time period. We see the prison reform movement created by Dorothea Dix. We see abolitionism with William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, David Walker, the liberator of the North Star. We see Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, all being big part of this abolitionist movement. We see the women's rights movement and the creation of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott heading that up. There was a big debate over should women demand rights while African Americans were still so far behind women's rights in America. We see educational reform in the Northeast, especially with Horace Mann in Massachusetts, demanding full public education for all boys. And we also see the Transcendentalist movement headed by Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, and basically the getting back to nature, pushing and questioning the ideals of this new urban industrialized life in the North. And that's going to push new utopian communities. The most famous one was the Brook Farm experiment with the Transcendentalists that was successful for a little bit before it failed. You also see a lot of religious communities like the Shakers, the Oneida community, the Noise community, and eventually, probably the most successful of the religious communities, the Mormons, that will flee from one place to another, eventually settling in the Salt Lake Desert in present-day Utah. There's a really good chance that in the AP test in 2020, we will get a DBQ from this time period. We have not had a DBQ from 1800, 1845 in quite a few years. This would be a great period for the AP and College Board to focus on. I would highly recommend spending a lot of time focusing on this time period. Again, we're going to spend all sorts of time in all sorts of time periods. But again, this one is probably a little bit more on the radar for a lot of people as maybe a focus of this year's test. Hopefully this all helps. Keep on studying, keep on trying hard, and good luck. Have a great night and good day, guys.